Well, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sovereign Nature Initiative's monthly talk series. This month's talk is an art talk, and we are privileged to welcome Entangled Others Studio as our speakers today. We will be hearing about their work in a presentation and then have the opportunity to ask these amazing artists some questions. A little bit of introductions. My name is Seth Boakley. I'm the writer in residence here at Sovereign Nature Initiative, and I tend to be the MC also for many events. And I like to interview folks as part of this talk series. And I'm joined today by a co-host. Andrea, will you introduce yourself?
Hello, my name is Andrea, and I am directing the research at Sovereign Nature Initiative. And I am really extra excited about today's talk on pushing the imagination of how to express entanglement, how to express more than human worlds. It's by no means a trivial question. And I think that the work of our artists here is really groundbreaking and pushing the limits of what can be done in this direction. So yeah, excited to be here.
Yeah, and I will mention that as well, that Sovereign Nature Initiative, as many of you know, has sort of three legs of the stool. There is art, there is theory, and there is technology. And so each month we alternate between focusing on one of those three sort of legs of the stool of our organization, as it were. And this month, of course, is art focus, but we love to think of ourselves as a crossroads for where those three things can connect and coincide. And Andrea is a huge part of that from the theory side. And so I'm thrilled to welcome again Entangled Others Studio. So Feileacan McCormick and Sofia Crespo are artists and co-founders of Entangled Others Studio. In their words, the studio is about moving further into an entanglement with the more than human world of us and others, a world where diversity and interconnectedness are nurtured and engaged. I love that. And so I'm going to turn it over to them to present their work for maybe half an hour or so. And afterwards, we'll have a chance to do a Q&A with them and learn about their process and ask any questions that you all have. Take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. So I'm Feileacan and this is Sofia. And as Seth so nicely introduced us, we're Entangled Others, a small studio that works primarily with art and, well, engagement with the modern human world. So what we'd like to do today is just to share a little bit of some of the thoughts behind some of our work, as well as a little handful of relevant works. And hopefully they'll be, of interest. So to start really with a very basic question, it's, can you imagine a color that you haven't seen before? This is a question that was first posed to me by Sofia, actually, and it's a very good one because in reality, you can't. I mean, try as you might to imagine a color you haven't seen before, you can't. But at the same time, if you look at, for example, the Peacock Mantis shrimp as illustrated here, if we look closely at them, we find they have 12 to 14 photoreceptors. That means that they can potentially see a range of color far beyond what our 3 single photoreceptors can see. And we have many examples proven from especially the insect kingdom, that they perceive light waves and ranges of light way outside what we are able to perceive. So our understanding of the world is based upon what we know and experience, and very often we have a tendency to assume that that is the case for everything. And of course, that is, a rather problematic starting point. And if we move forwards, then we have another question, like, can you imagine an animal you've never seen before? These are illustrations from the medieval times where illustrators have been tasked with basically illustrating an animal they haven't seen themselves, but that somehow, they have been described. And that is...
sorry, I just...
sorry about that, but that they hadn't actually in reality seen. So what we see are these animals that are clearly chimeras of what they know, for example, some kind of rat or dog-like creature with a fish tail, the beaver, the hippopotamus, which is this weird mix of fish with some kind of nostril extending up to the water. The oyster as this weird angry shell. We have all these sort of weird chimeras. And at the same time, if we speed forward to today, very often when we sort of talk about sustainability or the future of somehow, of green future, it's very often basically whatever we have now with either some greenery on top, quite literally, or a green filter, or we have some idea of some technology that doesn't exist yet that kind of fixes everything. So what we really have is the status quo. And when we as artists work with AI, what we generally work with, to be oversimplified, we are not engineers, so we're going to take some liberties here, but basically it's a form of visual distillation, at least in the way that we use it. And that means that when we take a data set, for example, of hundreds of thousands of images of jellyfish and feed those into a neural network and train a model upon it and get like examples like this, which are generated as part of a project, this jellyfish does not exist, what we get is some essential distillation of what that data set contains.
Yeah, and the reason why we're so fascinated with AI as a tool is because basically neural networks they're in general society, like the way we look at them, they're definitely overhyped and very mystified. But in reality, what they do is extract patterns from data. And that's really powerful to us as artists if we want to use that to kind of augment our creative process. So that's the way that we see these neural networks, and in the context of like the potential for art creation. So yeah, as Feileacan said, these examples are jellyfish that were generated based on a data set. And basically the reason why he asked earlier, if you can imagine a color that you've never seen before, is because in the same way that there is a limit to our own imagination based on what we've been able to perceive, there is a limit to what a neural network can create based on a given data set. So something I really like to say is that what you give is what you get. You'll never have a neural network creating something that wasn't related to the data that it learned from. So, yeah.
And I mean, this is sort of exemplified in continuation of the jellyfish example. The images available to us when we were gathering images of jellyfish, for example, only represent one small part of what is a typical jellyfish life cycle, which actually takes numerous different forms, which are radically different from what we associate with jellyfish. Yet, if you look for jellyfish, 9 times out of 10, what you will basically discover of results is this classical image of the jellyfish. Now, what this means is that we have a representation of the natural world, of the more than human worlds in our digital everyday life, where the data is, well, somewhat lacking. And of course, it's not like it's hard, right, to create data sets of nature. Well, in fact, it's really, really hard, which can go some way to explaining why. Because, for example, here you see these beautiful plants, which are, believe it or not, incredibly well camouflaged to look like the rock shale-like substrate that they inhabit. So nature can be said to be quite adversarial in terms of how we think of data and creating data sets. And of course, just gathering data about the natural world is very difficult. But at the same time, there's also not a lot of incentive. And, as humans, we generally tend to concern ourselves with human things. So what we often have in our world is mundane data. So what that means is data that is, relevant to our mundanity. Like we have this with standard data sets like ImageNet, for example, which is almost 15 million images that represent everything from cats, dogs, buildings, toasters, bicycles, all these basic things. And what you get from those when you using neural networks is you get mundane models.
Yeah, so just for clarification, all the images you see on your right side are generated, and all the images you see on the left side are a data set. So those are real images. And as you can see, like the ones that the neural network generated, they look very close to the original data, and they look understandable vaguely, or, you know, most of them do. But as you can see, like there's nothing there that's been generated which is completely out of the ordinary data that it learned from.
So, yeah, and this is very problematic because we are in a very changing world. To quote the magnificent Alex Steffen, there is no new normal. In the sense that we have reached a stage in the world now where things are very much in flux, they're changing very quickly. So what we have is we have these standard data sets, which are often used and based upon, you know, all the everyday data that's available to us. What we get are mundane models. And the problem with mundane models are that they don't really operate very well within a changing world. So what we have is this issue where the mundane model is relevant for a while, but as our world is changing so quickly, it very quickly becomes irrelevant or struggles with its relevancy. And as artists, one of the interesting things to do is to try and push these kind of standard models and data sets to try and reach out towards this, because in order for us to, you know, do something about this, we have to become aware of that. You know, we have to understand the limits of our knowledge to quest out beyond them, to reach out and to build stepping stones in directions. So a lot of our work as artists isn't about, you know, trying to dream up something new, but rather to, you know, double down on being very subjective humans and focus, you know, on reaching out towards the natural world. Because, and especially these days with the, you know, the all-prevalent digital spaces and artificial life forms, you know, are a way of engaging and entangling people, not just by, you know, trying to drag them out into the woods and going, here's a beautiful little fungi, you know, or having everyone dive. These are all very sort of hard things to do if you want to scale it up, but everybody almost these days is on the digitals. So this question is one of these sort of questions we work with on a daily basis of how we can use the digital and all these new fantastic technologies as a way of entangling with the modern human world and natural world, rather than, you know, somehow trying to, you know, escape into it. So that's just like a little bit of some of the thoughts behind some of our works, but I think it sort of like explains quite well what we're up to. So moving here now, we'd like to talk about a couple of our projects that we've been doing and how they relate to that.
Yeah, this artificial romance, the project you see here, was one of our first collaborations. It started around 3 years ago now, and I was at a period of transition where I had been generating life forms in 2D images, and when I met Feileacan, one of the first intersecting points for us was moving from 2D to 3D. And I introduced him to machine learning, and he introduced me to more like 3D techniques. And when I told him what I wanted to do, he said, like, very quickly, after learning even how I was working and my workflow, he said, like, wait, I have an idea of how we can do this. And our first kind of project was about insectal life forms. So what we did is we first created these life forms. The first generation didn't look as good as this one, to be very honest. We did several generations of these insects. And afterward, we generated a 3D texture on top with another algorithm. And then we gave them motion. The motion, unfortunately, isn't done with neural networks, but the texture and the creature itself is. And on the first iteration, we presented it with generative anatomical parts too. So we wanted to kind of generate the whole biology of this creature that doesn't exist. And in a way that's, for us, that was like extracting patterns of how we humans study the natural world. And in that study, how we make sense of it. So the way that we use science to make sense of things forces us to kind of encapsulate things, to be able to understand them and to analyze a system, a natural system. So, well, this is currently like the latest exhibition. It's a really huge inflatable sculpture in Shanghai. I think it's 10 meters or 11 meters tall. Unfortunately, we've never been able to see it. We just have pictures. We cannot travel there due to COVID, but we're very proud of where it's gone. This is another specimen. It's also in Shanghai. It's printed with a technique which is polyjet printing. This was like one of our dreams from the moment we began this series, because this technique allows you to print in color as well. So we wanted to print the texture onto the creature. And moving on, these are renders that Feileacan worked on. And like part of these, the thought behind this is to look at these creatures in a natural context. So outside of the kind of scientific study of them, and just like, where would they live? What would they be doing?
And it's also been for us a question, because one of the things we quickly found when working on the series was, of course, the lack of 3D models of insects that are, openly available to use out there is actually very small. So what we can generate in terms of diversity, even though these look, quite wild in their own way, what we very quickly find is, if we go look at the actual insect realm out there, anytime we've generated something, we have felt like, wow, this is, quite out there. We go out and are somewhat suitably humbled by the most incredible, amazing, weird forms and colors and interactions in the insect world. So for us, this has also been, exploring very much like what's available with the data, and at the same time, what can the digital do? And what we found was, by creating web experiences, thanks to the pandemic, but also working with augmented reality, is that people have a somewhat more relaxed relationship to insects when they're virtual. And this can, be quite an interesting stepping stone to try and talk about issues such as compassion towards the insects, because, we have very little in terms of facial features or ways of mapping ourselves onto them in a way that we can recognize ourselves in them. And at the same time, the insects, are being shown more and more through studies to actually have very complex reasoning and ability to, potentially even dream and so on. So there's a lot more to the insect world than we think, but at the same time, we are wholly, as humans, wholly dependent upon the insect realm, and it's remaining healthy. So for us, it's been quite fascinating to explore, using these technologies to create that kind of interaction.
Yeah, and in 2020, when the pandemic struck and we were faced with not knowing what would happen to us, to our careers as artists, all our clients had been canceled, and it was kind of like a big, difficult moment. We were at the same time commissioned on one exhibition, the only one that was still going on, and we decided to use that as an opportunity to change the line of thought that we had been fostering until that moment. And instead of looking at a single creature, or like a single creature in the context of science, we wanted to look at the whole ecosystem, and the way that, to make sense of ecosystems, we also encapsulate them. So we built kind of like an imaginary boundary around it to study it and to make sense of the interactions between its inhabitants. And we felt like the marine coral reef ecosystem was a perfect example of that, because you cannot say that a coral reef consists of a single coral or even just coral. Coral reefs are deeply interconnected, and there are several species that need to coexist in the same environment for it to have a healthy flow and for it to function. So there's this kind of concept of existing in relationship to others that became really important for us. And ultimately, that was the point where we decided to change our name to Entangled Others.
Yeah, and because especially sort of when you look at the coral reefs, which we ended up, having the focus of this, is because, they're a fascinating example of a very small percentage of, area in terms of ocean floor, but they are an ecosystem, of organisms, and this little system impacts, biodiversity around the whole world's oceans. And it's this fascinating interactivity where you can't really pull anyone of the inhabitants out and say, this is the reef. It emerges from them being together. And at the same time, when we were starting to work with okay, we want to start generating, these coral reefs, we ran into this problem of that there's very little data out there. In fact, there was so little data that we teamed up with a fellow artist, Joel Simon, who's done fantastic work with genetic algorithms and who we used to help basically generate, coral data sets using genetic algorithms based upon observations of corals.
Yeah, so Joel had been developing this genetic algorithm to grow coral in 3D, and we were immediately fascinated by his work. And since we were facing this problematic of not having these 3D data sets that we needed, he helped us. So we used his algorithm to generate the data set. And at some point, you might be wondering, why go through the trouble of generating an artificial data set to train an artificial neural network? But I swear it all makes sense to us. And yeah, and well, so this became kind of part of the statement of the piece in itself, the lack of data, and especially open source data.
Yeah, and at the same time, what we realized very quickly was that even though we have very little data available to us, what's interesting about this is it still opens up for a space within the digital to create some kind of connection to, the coral reefs out there, not necessarily in the direct sense, but through our ability to actually use what we have available within, the more human space, perhaps so to speak, and to sort of illustrate really the limits of what we can represent, but still use that as a way of storytelling. So, storytelling is a form of active dreaming, to tell a story, you tell what you know. And of course, that means that you don't tell what you don't know, but you also tell about what you believe in. And, in that sense, with a story, you can also sense the contours of the unknown. And this is really important for us because by using data available to us, by working with these limitations, we can at once, within the digital, work with entangling people into, encountering a coral reef, in their everyday life in a way that can be interactive in, various mediums, but at the same time, hints about that there's more out there. And so we've worked with this in multitudes of ways, from AR to the sculptural, finding all these sort of different ways of engaging and very much as an experimentation. We do a lot of experimentation where we test out these different ways of presenting and working with that, because for us, a lot of these works are also about, trial and error, to sort of find ways of creating mirrors that reflect back, our image of the world. This is where, AI comes in and so useful because it distills it really down. You get a very clear distillation of your own biases. So for example, if we're selecting a data set of jellyfish, perhaps we start discarding all the dead jellyfish that have images of dead jellyfish that have washed up on the beach because, they don't necessarily quite fit. So already there as artists, even subconsciously, we start to bias these data sets. So we're not creating objective images of the world, but rather, we have our own humanity reflected back to us. And this is, of course, quite a powerful thing. And of course, well, we've worked in this in a multitude of ways, sculptural again in Shanghai, and also, you know, digitally. And
and then we arrived to the last project that we want to share with you. This one is called Hybrid Ecosystems, and it started in 2021, right?
Yeah.
And it was mainly Feileacan's idea. He reads lots of sci-fi, and we're talking about this kind of world where there's no boundary between technology and nature. And this is something that we had been discussing for a while, really inspired in Timothy Morton's writings about what defines technology, what defines nature, and particularly this kind of nature as something that we, as a construct, something that doesn't fully really exist, something that we created to understand, to build like a separation for ourselves. So Feileacan had this idea of like creating these ecosystems where microchips and nature are kind of like one and the same. And something I find like kind of a good example to understand is when for example, when a bird builds a nest, we don't look at that bird thinking like, oh, well, it's using sticks and whatever it has in its environment, and it builds a technology from that. But when we take silicon and elements that are in the natural world already, and we use them to repurpose them, for example, to build a microchip, we think like, oh, well, that's different because that's a human creation and that deserves to be separated and to stand above everything else. So that's kind of like where we think that part of seeing ourselves in the natural world is like a grounding act for us as humans, and very necessary these days. So.
And this series came about kind of also in relation to this question earlier about the imagining a more sustainable future, and, you know, the sort of tendency to go towards greenery or unknown technologies. And that sort of like is a very sort of limited in its sort of imaginative capacities. So part of the series is also trying to start with, you know, our very sort of mundane models and stretch them to create these representations, not by saying that it's something brand new, but rather starting with the familiar, the known, and, you know, twisting, pushing, you know, tweaking and stretching it to sort of start building stepping stones towards something, a way of viewing the world as different. So thanks very much for listening, everyone. Yeah, we are.
Thank you.
Any questions you might have?
Thank you, Feileacan and Sofia. Amazing presentation. Doing the clap emojis like over here on Zoom. We at Sovereign Nature Initiative, I think I can speak for all of us. I know I can. We're huge fans of your work, and so I should have maybe underlined that's the reason. We're so happy that you're here. We love your work, and it's wonderful to hear about some of where it comes from, some of the points of inspiration, and of course, you know, the sense that you bring both experimentation and imagination, as well as, you know, humor. You know, it's just like work that just cuts through everything and gets right to us. I love, you know, this jellyfish does not exist. You know, riffing on sort of internet culture, how we're using artificial intelligence, tending to look at it, artificial intelligence and humor always through a human lens. But how could we even look at the world of more than human world and its own, in a sense, sense of humor? I love the spirit of the work. So yeah, we'll open it up to questions in just a moment. And I know Andrea has some questions she brought to the party as well. Yeah, but if you have a question for Entangled Others, feel free to raise your hand, type it into the chat. Or Andrea, why don't you kick off with something that's on your mind?
Yeah, thank you very much. Cool. I already raised my hand to be a good student and get in line. So thank you so much for the presentation. And I really think that it was really, for me, very interesting to hear you speak about this. I've seen your piece exhibited here at the Fiber Festival in Amsterdam, and I've looked at the things on the website a lot. And I think that really hearing you speak about it gives a lot of super good context to it. And I'm really just curious to hear a little more about, so I think if I understood, or if I heard you right, I think one of the main tenets of the work that you do is to say you want to show how much is not visible and not known. So starting from this idea of, can you imagine a color that you have never seen, by really just going out there and doing all of these imaginative things that Seth, in a sense, described so beautifully. And I think that that's such a intriguing way of going about it. But I would like to ask you a little more on how you see, because you started with the explanation of the data and the model and the, in a sense, a bit of a mismatch that also over time becomes more of a mismatch. But I would like to push you on that a little bit, to ask a little more like, how is this, what's the perception that is underneath this model on the idea of what is this data, or where does the representation start? Because in a sense, a little bit, it's as if the representation starts with the model, and that the model is not quite right, but the data is there in a like raw way, and it's the question of accessibility. So I'm pushing you now to the corners in a sense of the conceptual underground, and I hope you don't mind me asking this, but I think that you've been thinking and working on this so much that I think for me, yeah, does this translate into, do you want to make more things accessible, or show that there is an inaccessibility that is given in this very limited position of the human, and then provide and push for an ethical change in light of this awareness, or something of this kind? If you can make something of this very convoluted question.
Yeah, so something that we got asked already a few times is, why do you use AI, which is currently like an instrument of power, to generate these works? Why don't you just use another technique to do it? And for me, like, I can say that it pushes me to admit that there's a bias in what I do, because every time that I filter through inputs, I filter through outputs, and I'm making decisions of like what an aesthetically pleasing jellyfish looks like to me at that moment, and which output there resonates with what I want to keep. So I think it's more about opening a conversation about these issues than saying like I have an answer or a solution to them. And yeah, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that we can never know what it's like to be a tree. Now, we are humans, and we have, a human starting point from our experience, which means to say that no matter how much data I collect about a tree, no matter how granular I can get it, I still won't experience the world as a tree does. And it's very important to understand that this is perfectly okay. And when we talk a lot about these mundane models and the mundane data, it's also to point out that this data is not raw. It's already curated. The very fact that you take a picture of something and upload it and make it available to be part of a data set like this is already some kind of choice on some level to say that this is somehow representative or this is not. And what we have is that we have these vast data sets. We recently trained a model on some 3 million images of 10,000 different species of animal, plants, fungi, birds, you name it. And that's 10,000 species over some 3 million images. We know of approximately 8.3 million species in the world, and we estimate we might be missing out on about up to 40% more. So the amount of data we have is incredibly little. And at the same time, it's not feasible without, being equally destructive to go out there and actually collect all that data about all the species. It's kind of like trying to solve thing brute force, but I think it's a lot more about trying to embrace our subjectivity, to say that we are human and we have a limited world we can know, but that doesn't mean that we can't still tell stories that somehow allow us to exist harmoniously with a tree, even though we can never be the tree or understand it fully, and it will always be some kind of alien in that sense. That doesn't mean that we aren't part of the same world and can't have a positive relationship, but I think that comes through embracing our subjectivity, our biases, and owning them, making them our own. But I will stop there before I go off on a complete rant.
That was great. Thank you for the great question and answer. I know Marie Petersman, who has joined us previously as a speaker in this very series, has a question. Go for it, Marie.
Thank you. Thank you also from my end for really a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed delving a bit more into your work. I wanted to come back to two elements that you mentioned in your presentation. Oh, sorry, Seth, I thought it was a message to me. The first question relates to what you mentioned as the new normal. And I wanted to push you a bit on what exactly do you conceive as the new when you speak about the new normal? Is it because somehow entanglement to me is something that has always existed. It has always been, the world has always emerged or be enacted through forms of entanglement between human and non-human agencies, etc. So is it about developing new technologies to capture entanglements that have already and always existed, or is it about new forms of entanglements that, for example, against the backdrop of the Anthropocene, we could say that somehow entanglements are new as well? I mean, there are new forms of entanglement, perhaps. And the second question concerns your name. You mentioned that you had changed your name to Entangled Others. And I wanted to know, because again, from entanglement, from a perspective of, or at least my understanding of entanglement, somehow it fits a bit uncomfortably with the notion of others, because otherness, I mean, isn't the purpose of entanglement to bridge a bit this divide, this dichotomy with the otherness? I mean, that the other is then emerging through the entanglement itself. So if you could, come back to these two questions, that would be very nice. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Those are great questions. Just to sort of start with the first one, I think the point of talking about the new normal, or rather that there is no new normal, that we exist, more and more in a flux state of time, isn't to sort of say that we can solve things. I think for us, it's been a lot more about trying to avoid solutionism and rather see like, how can we create ways of experiencing the world or working with our experiences of the world that embraces, being vulnerable and being in a world that's changing, but that doesn't mean that we still can't have, strong connections to the world, and that these connections and what we build them upon through, embracing the fact that we are subjective, that we are, we're not going to be able to ever, put a single solution over a wicked problem, but rather we have to embrace diversity. We have to find a multitude of ways that, will in part be completely paradoxical. They will crash into each other, bounce off, create weird new synergies. But that's, that's part of being human. That's the fact that we have to step away from the idea that there is a simplified model, but rather, spread out horizontally, perhaps, I think is a way of saying that. I hope that answers in some way the question a little.
Yeah, and I think that when we chose the name Entangled Others, partly it was because for us, we see ourselves entangled with, like the world. We wanted to kind of reach this point of view, but at the same time, we're very much aware that there's still a clear divide between us and the others, and that a lot of creatures are considered the other. So we wanted to kind of own this word and claim it back, and put it in the context of entanglement. So yeah, that's basically what felt right to us. But I really liked your point on that, and yeah.
Yeah, it's a super great philosophical point. When does the entanglement create a new us or a new we? It's a great conversation to keep having. Oscar, and then Rodrigo after that.
Hi. Well, thank you for the lecture. It was really interesting to listen to you guys. I have to say, well, in my own case, I don't know if I'm going to be able to place in the end one specific question, but I just wanted to share some thoughts. Well, it's interesting to think about the genealogy of this type of conversation, you know. Myself being interested on this type of commonality between the organic and artificial. You think of like from the foundational publications like in the West on the topic, like you know, in the mid 20th century already, like 7 decades ago, you had this famous cybernetics communication and control in the animal and the machine, as you know. Like, so and that's in the West, like not to speak about indigenous ways of thinking, that I'm seeing a commonality between the human and the non-human and the more than human constantly. So I was just kind of like trying to understand your agenda, I guess, as in a creative sense. I don't know, like, you know, I think it's interesting that you guys are engaging with AI. I don't think there is any kind of technology that is kind of, you know, like touched by the devil and no one else should touch it. You know, I think it's very interesting, some of the things that you are doing, but perhaps what I'm missing is where are you going with it? And to try to turn it down into a question, you know, it's I can almost imagine the engineers behind neural networks during the process of creating these neural networks, already thinking, wow, I'm sure artists are going to have a lot of fun with this because you can come up with things that do not exist. And so, you know, like I think it's almost like inherent to the technology in itself. Like the premise of the technology in itself is that it's going to give you this kind of outcomes, and glitches, you know, are fun and all of that. But I don't really see in the end where is the connection between the artificial and the organic in a non-normative way. I feel the normativity still, for me, feels like it still has some weight. For instance, when you show the work as an AR piece, you know, like, I mean, we all see Pokemons on lakes. So I really wonder, like, where are you going with it? And perhaps it's something that you feel you have already achieved, or you're perhaps in the midst of going there, because it's quite a complex endeavor that you are taking. So I say this with a lot of admiration and respect, so please take it in that way.
Oh, thank you. I think, like, off the bat, we definitely haven't found any sort of solution, so to speak, nor do we have really any intention in that sense. This is, you know, for us very much an active exploration, but it's also about one where we're trying to, you know, starting, you know, from the point of living, you know, in a Western society, living within these stories and these contexts. A lot of what we see more and more is that, yes, we have all these technologies, they're all stacked up that, you know, lead in certain directions. But what often is missing, you know, is you have like this arms race within the technological world about the newest, and, you know, this concept of novelty. But that doesn't really have any deeper storytelling to it. And what we see very often is that a lot of these technologies and the way we, they lack a clear story or storytelling, or they just become, you know, motors that propagates, you know, the status quo, and, you know, the status of quo's a tendency to love novelty, you know, as quick consumption moving on.
Yeah, and it happened, I mean, a few times that, like, people look at it and think, like, at first our work is a tech demo, or that we're trying to show off a technology. And for us, that's really not the point. Like, the point isn't to show the technology in itself, but to have a conversation about it and to kind of open up a dialogue about the things that we're thinking and exploring through that. And one of the things that originally drew me to feel fascinated by neural networks is the fact that artificial neural networks were even if vaguely inspired by organic neural networks. So just this basic structure of a neuron that takes input and output, and there's a function in that neuron that processes data, and the way that these neurons exist interconnected with each other. So to see that in a digital realm where you feed a neural network millions of images, and each pixel in each of those images becomes a single neuron, and all the interconnection of those neurons through the layers of the neural network slowly give you the rise to these patterns. So that was something that, like the why behind our interest in the technology, particularly because it is technology that is inspired in the functioning of something that's already there. And it's us as humans trying to understand that. So, but this is art. So for us, it's a process of storytelling. And yeah.
I think it's also this sort of the difference between a story and folklore. And I think like what we have is, you know, the potential, especially these days with technology and accessibility to it, to have, you know, a myriad of different voices telling different stories that engage in different ways with this topic, you know, everything from, for example, my standing point coming, you know, from Northwestern Europe to, you know, indigenous voices from very different places and very different backgrounds. These can all, you know, come together, because what we need, you know, is many stories, many different approaches to these issues of, you know, the digital physical, to how we see the natural world, how we engage with it. And hopefully, you know, the sum of a rich, diverse, you know, cacophony of stories can help nudge our more sort of like general momentum off. But I don't think, for us at least, it's never about trying to find a way of seeing the world or a solution. It's more we're experimenting from our standpoints and trying to sort of somehow touch upon things there. So yeah, thank you. It's a great question. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for this is a conversation, and it's beautiful to think of that the multiplicity you know, that can come out of this session itself, fractal patterns of conversations emerging. Rodrigo, you've got a question or a comment, please.
Hey, hello everyone. Well, thank you very much for your the insights in your art. It's really interesting to me. And I had a question that maybe it's a little bit more practical, and it's regarding distribution. As you are so committed into digital art, obviously I also have seen some forms of physical art, but because you're so committed also in digital art, I wanted to have your opinion on all these, you know, NFT movements, and if you ever thought about distributing your art as an NFT or not. And of course, there are multiple concerns regarding the environmental impact of some blockchains, like for example, Ethereum, and obviously other blockchains doesn't have this impact, but there are multiple concerns about it. As artists, I really wanted to have your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. NFTs are something that we've been thinking and talking about a lot. I was introduced to them a couple of years ago, before the whole issue with environmental concerns happened. And it suddenly was a moment of
Oh dear.
Yeah, of like a kind of rethinking like our own relationship to that form of commercialization of our work. And yeah, we started to talk a lot more about, you know, like sources, energy sources, and the way that we would like to have that happen in the future. And yeah, I can say like we have used both Ethereum, Tezos, Polygon for selling our works, and yeah,
I mean, the thing is, like, the whole NFT business and blockchain business in general is, you know, hideously complex. But speaking as artists who work digitally, it makes a lot of sense to be able to allow digitals to remain, artworks to remain digital natives. And this in itself, you know, is quite positive as well. I think the problem has been, you know, a lot of course is this hype and this whole gold rush sort of issues around these things. Because the basic mechanism in itself, you know, being able to sell an artwork as an artist, be it physical or digital, is in itself relatively unproblematic. I think that what we still have is, you know, it's a very early field and there's a lot of hype. And at the end of the day, nothing is going to, you know, revolutionize. I think we're sort of past the point of revolutionization in that sense, you know. It's an interesting complement. It definitely complements, you know, the more traditional art world and traditional models. And it has been able to, you know, help a lot of artists who come from, you know, backgrounds and locations which aren't traditionally represented within, you know, the traditional art world as readily. That has opened up for, you know, smaller communities to, you know, sort of like emerge from, you know, what has been a feature of, you know, the digital arts, which has been these smaller communities. And that has, you know, in itself been, for the most part, I think, potentially quite positive. But at the end of the day, you know, there are still a lot of things to be fixed. But I think that it's also, you know, it's important to remember that these problems exist within the context of, you know, the rest of the world too. And we have to, you know, equally approach like issues of trying to make things more green, you know, both on the front of like NFTs and blockchains, but also with everything else. You know, we can't just shout loudly about one thing and run away from all the other problems. I think it's important to keep these things in perspective as well.
Yeah, and I feel like I could talk about this topic for hours because there's so much to say about it. I definitely talk to like my artist friends, and I have some friends who are completely against the idea of NFTs altogether, some others that are just really scared. And some others are fully into it, you know, and say like, I gotta make a living through my work, and you know, like it should be fine for me to use resources as well, like as companies, like big companies are allowed to do so. And I totally respect these two sides. So I feel like for us, we have kind of, we're constantly thinking and yeah, we have these two sides, like we got to make a living through the work. And at the same time, like if we can use the alternatives that are more eco-friendly, we try to use them. But yeah, as I said, like I could be talking about it forever, so I'm just gonna stop myself there.
It's a great conversation, and thanks to Rodrigo for bringing it up. And Feileacan and Sofia, you've obviously thought deeply about it. You know, at Sovereign Nature Initiative, we're also asking questions about, you know, NFTs and where the proof of stake possibility exists to have marketplaces that don't actually depend upon the proof of work that's so notorious now for its energy consumption. But that's it's an ongoing conversation within the art world, within other parts of the NFT and technology world. And we're really eager to just, you know, take the bull by the horns and get into that for sure. I also want to mention, like Rodrigo said, you know, it's really impressive that you all, you know, that you use both digital and physical work. And I think it's great to, you know, bring up the ethics of both of these worlds too. You know, how do we think about the rare minerals that are involved in our computers or our 3D printers with our plastics, and, you know, where are we making impact on the world around us? And I had one more comment, but Andrea, you've got something. You raised your hand. Go to you.
I just want to ask a follow-up question on the NFT debate, because I think indeed, like one of the things that at SNI we are wrestling with a lot is the question of what form of representation is a token and what can be expressed in tokens. So in a like infrastructural, or if you so wish, architectural design way, the mode of expressing through tokens is a very particular one, and has its opportunities and its limitations in a sense. But if trying to think tokens together with the idea of entanglements, very soon you're falling back on the idea of an atomistic unit of something like that. So I would just like to hear if you have what your thoughts are on the conceptual question of NFTs, rather than, I mean, I understand, and I think very important what you said, but then also on these things, and maybe that is not an NFT specific question, but rather has to do with digital representations in general. So I would be very curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think like a lot of these uses of technology, and technology these days has become, very much a source of controversy because they are very much amplifying, just in the way that neural networks distill, and build up kind of like a representation of the essential qualities of a data set. What we see with a lot of these digital platforms and solutions or products, whatever you have, what have you, is that they make very clear to us, for better or for worse, the sort of inherent cultural societal bias towards certain kinds of thinking. And this can be hugely problematic. This has been the problem with NFTs, is they don't fix human nature. Blockchain does not fix human nature, and it's often quite, some of the implementations have been downright problematic because they somehow are based upon some idea of human interaction, which does not reflect reality, wherein you have a huge mess of actors, both, benevolent and malevolent, in constant flux. And this is really highly problematic, especially when we talk about ideas of governance, of better representation, like who builds these structures, how are they really democratizing? And what we see, for example, is that some of these structures that have been the most democratic, for example, the HTTP protocol and email, are also some of the hardest to change, because when something becomes democratically adopted, as a whole, if it's really available to everyone, it's very hard to change in any real manner. It becomes relatively static. And of course, this, completely clashes with this whole drive towards newer, better solutions that we have. A lot of the whole sort of like rationale behind a lot of the drives we have these days is, faster, better, stronger. And so we have this kind of like constant friction, and I don't know if you want to add something to that, but
I think that's something that I personally find very interesting about like the token itself, is that in a way it makes us rethink the idea of value and what we give value to, because if you have a JPEG as a token and 10 people agree this is really valuable, some other one comes and says like, what, this is not valuable at all, like what can I do with this? And then like there's kind of a consensus of like, this is a really, really valuable JPEG and it's worth millions. It's kind of like, it's a really interesting thing to see from the perspective of like, it makes us rethink like what kind of things do we value, and being able to see that, like being able to look at all these transactions and like see the provenance of a piece is something that in a way like is really empowering to us as artists, but it also can be really damaging. Like if everybody agrees that suddenly our work isn't valuable at all, then that could be damaging. So there's kind of really interesting factors at play, and it's just something like that that I think about a lot, like the idea of consensus and like agreeing on something being valuable. So I don't know if that answers the question at all, but yeah,
totally.
Yeah, it's a really good conversation about value, and value, whose values are in the mix, as it were, in these conversations, is something we're thinking about as well at Sovereign Nature Initiative, thinking even about, what is nature's value to itself, in addition to value for humans, of course, or for individual or groups of humans. And I guess that was my last question for you guys. And I want to say too that, we're at the hour, and the Entangled Others is going to be part of our experimental zone in Amsterdam, and at the end of May 21st is going to be our public portion of the event, and I hope you all will be able to come and see their installation there. We're so happy to be able to work with you guys and feature your work and partner with you, because there's such connection and synergy between our works. But if you could stick around for just a few more minutes, it's a great conversation going on. I know I had one question, I guess, about that question of audience. Like you guys talked about, how humans look at the natural world, as being something you're pushing. And I kept thinking about the first slide that you had about the color spectrum, and we see this much of it. And this is a little anecdote that will lead to a question, but I took a class on cognitive neuroscience in college, and there was a unit on facial recognition, and there's a disorder where prosopagnosia.
And it happened. We were almost through. No, in the middle of Seth's very own question. Oh no.
Dear me. Well, we were warned, to be fair.
I was really listening. I was like, it sounds super interesting.
Well,
so
I think maybe he had a power outage again. But
yeah. I think so. I mean, if you can pick up whatever you want from that question and go with it, that's good. Or if not, we give him maybe a chance to come back. But I really do also think, I mean, given that it's 4 minutes past 6, I look at Caitlin to ask for instruction.
Yeah, let's just wait for Seth, give him about another minute or two, and then we can jump off for the evening.
Super good, super good. I mean, maybe I'll just say one more thing to what you said, Sofia, about the value and the expression of value. So I think that one of the things that I find so fascinating is that really, I think that that's what I picked up from you. On the one hand, NFTs become a mode of expressing affect in a very in a sense that was very difficult to see before. It's a very immediate expression of, I like this, for whichever reasons. Now, could be speculative, could be whatever it is, but there is something that has been made available for an expression of affect or consideration of value that is really there. And yet, on the other hand, what we have is an idea of value that is really price mechanism based. The idea that the value is constituted through whatever the price mechanism does, which is a very particular conservative theory of value in many ways. So I think that there's really still much to be considered about how can a token be an expression of value with a different value theory underpinning it, where you can keep up this idea of an expression of affect that is very immediate, but without falling back onto a price mechanism idea and an idea of extracting profits.
Absolutely. And I think there are several artists who are owning up to that as a medium in itself, to say I'm going to price this piece to an insane amount, but just because it means something to me, not because I expect anybody to come to buy it, Mm-hmm. So that kind of has a performance in itself. In our case, that's not particularly, we're not using the token as a medium in itself, but it is really interesting, when artists do. And yeah, I think at least in our case, it was really reassuring to know that I don't have to print my work. I don't have to become a printmaker to, give my work to somebody and for them to be able to collect it. And to know that they own an original. So that sounds just really reassuring to digital artists in that sense.
And it's also very much a question of what we see, with this focus on value and monetization is, very much a very, not so flattering reflection of the world we've built for ourselves, as a whole. It very much mirrors the dominant strategies and narratives of, for example, the sort of American dream, so to speak, for example, which is a very prevalent narrative, even outside America, within the context of the Western world. And of course, it's no surprise that this codifies itself into this kind of behavior. So one of the questions I always have is what story could we tell that would be so effective that it would completely change that? You know, what kind of narratives will we have? Because if we look, you know, historically, you know, you used to have oral traditions where from generation to generation, important stories and knowledge was handed down and communicated. And thus you had, you know, a string of people communicating something of value through time. And that, you know, is without the sort of context of financial worth or value, but more in terms of social, cultural value. And this is really fascinating because these stories, you know, can be considered, you know, encoded tokens that are passed on because they have value in themselves. If you want to atomize it, which I'm not sure I recommend. Oh, he's back. But yeah, just to sort of say, like, I think that one of the questions is really interesting is like, what stories would we have to tell to completely change how we structure these kind of systems? You know, what story is necessary for that? Anyway, sorry, please continue, Seth.
I was so glad to be rejoining and then find some cool comment in progress, and sorry for getting kicked out. I got like epically kicked out of the session where I had to like turn off the internet and turn it back on again. So hopefully I'll be here for a few seconds. I can say my thing. Basically, I was simply sort of trying to bring up the issue of, you know, you guys seem to be playing with your algorithms at the edge of kind of cognitive perception from a human perspective. You know, we see insect-like things, and then it sort of triggers things in our brains, as similar to how when we see face-like objects, it triggers the part of our brain that is in a sense evolved to recognize faces. In the same way that we have a limited color spectrum, we also have an attraction to certain three-dimensional images, or an aversion to certain three-dimensional images that are spider-like or snake-like, perhaps, that are perhaps a result of evolution. And I guess I wondered if you would reflect a little bit on, like, you know, do you think that there may be an opportunity in your work to create shapes or colors or things or artworks that are also testing the limits of animal perception or non-human perception? Meaning, I was thinking about, like, you know, there's, you know, whistles that only dogs can hear, or, you know, symbols that are designed to scare birds away from crops or scarecrows or things like that, you know, that are designed for their kinds of perception. Have you ever played with that, the edge of that kind of way of making?
Not really, not explicitly that.
No, I mean, it's quite a fascinating thing, because the idea of like art for the more than human is sort of an interesting kind of paradox in itself. It's sort of like, but I think it touches upon something very interesting, which is this idea of mutually beneficial, which is a topic we have been discussing about our artworks. Like, how can we, for example, you know, bring the sculptural into the physical world in a way that is, you know, on the human level, something that can be appreciated or interacted with, but on the more than human level also provides some kind of beneficial interaction. You know, if it helps create some kind of shelter, or it helps some kind of like rejuvenation attempt, what have you. So this is kind of like a discussion we currently have ongoing.
I mean, in a way, it wouldn't be very consensual to tell them, like, this is an art I made for you, like, enjoy it, hate it, like.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also like this whole point of dog whistles is they're generally not necessarily happy about them either. They do catch their attention. And I think this is sort of like, especially the idea of consent, you know, with the modern human, is something that hasn't really factored into our stories in any real way, not for a very long time.
We still do something using like what we assume to be like their perception of reality.
Yeah.
Even though in a way it's like imposing as well. It's like saying, okay, this is how you see the world, you know? Like, and in a way, our whole approach is more like, we don't really know that much, you know. We are studying it, we're trying to make sense of it, but we don't fully understand what it is like to be a tree or to be a bee. I didn't intend for it to rhyme, but
we love poetry at Sovereign Nature Initiative. We love rhyming is always welcome. No, that's a great, I mean, you know, I think the idea of mutual exchange is super rich as well, and it's also something we're tending to think a lot about. Like, we don't assume that, you know, of course, that non-humans will experience art or want to see art the way that we do, or value things that we value, but the idea of proposing or considering a kind of exchange with nature is super provocative.
Yeah, and something I like is artist Alex Reben has done, he builds robots, and I like a lot, he has this piece where robots are consuming art. And, you know, it's kind of interesting because like we, you know, use technology as a medium, but we still communicate to humans. And it's kind of interesting to have something the other way around, to look at like technology consuming something that we are doing for them, kind of like serving. But yeah, no, that's a kind of different topic in itself, but yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for, anybody else have a last comment or question or anything else from the two of you want to share before we wrap it up? Thank you so much again to Entangled Others Studio. It's a delight to have you with us today. This recording will be available, including me glitching out and leaving mid-sentence, like frozen like this probably, and also the wonderful presentation that you gave. And thank you so much for being part of the SNI community. And thank you all for listening today and for your great questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.